welcome to the third audio in this series. In the last audio, I spoke about the intense emotional journey that we experience during the process of bereavement. And I spoke about some of the more powerful emotions that we will inevitably feel at some point during that process. During any bereavement that we experience in the course of our lives, particularly if the person who's died was very close to us or we had a significant relationship with them, then there's the potential for a multitude of different emotional layers to become activated. In this audio, I'm going to talk about some of the complex dynamics that can become activated as part of the running of this huge program that I spoke about in the last audio. Before I start to talk in more depth and more detail about some of these layers of emotions and the complexities of the emotional dynamics that play out during the bereavement and grieving process, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the ways that our internal emotional systems work. Our emotions are an extraordinary gift, and they fundamentally serve two primary purposes for us. Firstly, they're part of our navigational system. They give us the information that we need to define our experiences. How do we know if something's okay or not? Our feelings will tell us. So our emotions give definition to everything that we're receiving. Our mind then interprets this information, and we can then act accordingly. So emotions are there to inform us, to give us information, which we can in turn respond to. And the nature of our response is very important. The second primary function of our emotions is that they give us energy. They generate the power to turn thought into action. When we're emotionally clogged up, we very often find it difficult to take action. If we're feeling stuck in some part of our lives, we can find ourselves tied up in habitual thinking, which goes round and round in circles. Our emotional energy is going nowhere. It isn't moving us forwards. In fact, it's being invested in going nowhere. So our emotions, in their best possible capacity, are effectively part of a transformational process. They give us information and then the power or the energy to create change and growth. And we're actually designed to grow. Whether we like it or not, we're actually continually growing. That's what life is about. We can resist growth, and to be fair, for most people, change can feel a very anxious business. But in truth, change and growth are taking place all of the time, whether we choose to be on board with it or not. So emotions are not supposed to be static. They're not designed to be that way. Access to our emotions gives us the power to make informed choices throughout our lives. They're there and available to us moment by moment to help us to navigate our lives, and they carry the potential for extraordinary transformational power. In an ideal world, our emotions will be in a state of flow or movement, and a natural part of everyday growth. They are transformational, and their role is one of active creativity. This continual stream of information, this two-way exchange, is an integral part of our natural evolutionary process of life, and it's a natural integral part of our capacity to create, to live, and to thrive. When we're unable to listen to the emotional content of our experience, our emotions become stuck in our system, like an emotional roadblock. When we understand the nature of our emotions and the crucial role that they carry for us, we can begin to understand why it is so important for us to develop our ability to be fully emotionally available to ourselves, to be fully present to our emotional experience and responsive to the way that we feel and to the information that our emotions are giving us. And we can begin to see why the relationship between our mind and our emotions is so significant and so influential in our adult lives. As adults, we have responsibility for our choices. When we're children, we're completely reliant upon our grown-ups to be emotionally responsive to us and for us, and to make appropriate choices for us and with us. And in an ideal world, this will set us up with a healthy blueprint to manage our emotional experiences throughout our lives. But the reality is that for most of us, there very often isn't a healthy blueprint. Not necessarily because our grown-ups were bad people or set out to get things wrong for us, but in truth, they grew up in a world where they weren't given a particularly good blueprint themselves. Now, I'm just going to acknowledge here that, of course, some adults actually do some dreadful things. There's a truth here that we need to acknowledge. And everything that I'm saying here is very relevant to the process of bereavement and grieving. Because when this epic program starts to run, and indeed will need to run its course, then any historical issues that are unresolved and unprocessed that have remained in our system, any historical emotionally laden experiences that we haven't been able to make sense of and integrate into some kind of learning experience that enabled us to grow, any emotional roadblocks that have become stuck inside of us, and any attitudes towards our emotions, any perceptions that we've inherited from our families and the social and cultural attitudes around us, any problems and any difficulties that we have in any of these areas are highly likely to surface during this highly charged emotional process of grieving. And this can happen in various ways. So let me say a little bit about the way that our emotions relate to time. I've just said that our emotions are not designed to be static. They flow, and when they get stuck or clogged up in our system, this causes us problems. Now, our mind has an understanding and a comprehension of time. Our mind has a perception of time. Our mind marks time. We calendar events and we timetable our lives. We live with an awareness of day and night, morning and afternoon, an awareness of seasons and of years. We have an awareness of past, of present and of future. Our mind processes our life experiences, makes sense of all this information, and in one way, shape or form, it then files it away. And our mind has an extraordinary capacity to store memory. But our emotions do not work in the same way. They have a very different relationship to time, and we do not have an endless capacity to store emotional memory. Let's talk about memory first. The best way that I can describe this, I think, is to use the metaphor of a filing system, like an internal filing cabinet or internal hard drive. And this is an emotional storage system. It's where we store all of our feelings and all of our emotional memory, everything we've ever experienced emotionally during the course of our life. Now, if an emotional experience has been successfully filed away, then the format that we've filed it in will be rather like a zipped folder or a compressed folder, and it won't take up a lot of memory space. In fact, virtually nothing at all. The experience will have held its emotional charge when it took place, and if it became part of a good, healthy learning curve, it will actually be filed away in a relatively emotionally neutral state. But if it hasn't been processed successfully, then it will still carry some of its emotional charge, and it will be a big folder, and it will be taking up a lot of space, a lot of emotional memory space. So let's think about this in relation to loss. In our internal filing system, we only have one file for loss. That's how the filing system works. All of our losses are kept in the one place. Now, if the contents of your loss file have historically been processed and filed away successfully, if they've been filed in an appropriate kind of format, and they're not taking up a massive amount of space, you'll be able to open that particular file and you'll be able to remember those losses. And you'll be able to remember all of the feelings associated with them. And you'll be able to have those feelings in a manageable way. In the first audio of this series, I spoke about emotional responsiveness and the way that we experience ourselves through our emotions. The way that our emotional experiences have been responded to will make the difference between something being processed and filed away successfully or not. The the way that our emotional experiences have been responded to will determine the format that these experiences have been filed in. So if they were managed well to start with, you'll be able to remember them in a manageable way. However, if the contents of any of your files haven't been processed properly, and they haven't been filed away successfully, if they haven't been responded to and managed well, then when you have a new bereavement or a new loss in the current time, because there is only one file for loss, when the loss file is reopened, then all of the feelings and emotions that haven't been understood and responded to thoughtfully and appropriately, any of the contents of that file which haven't been sorted out properly can start to spill out all over the place. The loss file is open and all of the contents are visible and available. This kind of thing can often happen if we've experienced loss in our childhood, because at that time we were simply unable to process it properly. Our child mind wasn't developed enough to take on this task. If we experience loss when we're young, then we will be entirely dependent upon our grown-ups to help us to process and successfully file our emotional experiences. And sometimes this simply doesn't happen. Not necessarily because our grown-ups are setting out to get it wrong, but sometimes they're just not well equipped to do this. They don't know how to, and sometimes their own emotional distress and difficulty will be so great that they'll be unavailable to support their children at this time, even if they really wanted to. So if we've experienced a significant loss and we haven't been able to sort it out, then when we experience the loss of someone at a later date, even someone with whom we weren't that close, the intensity of our emotions can really be ramped up, and sometimes even feel completely out of proportion to what's actually going on. Whenever we experience emotions that seem to be incredibly intense, or a bit out of proportion to the experience that we're actually having, then it's a good indication that something from the past has arrived in the present. Something hasn't been filed away successfully. A file has been opened and the emotional contents are arriving in our current time. So let's now talk about time. To illustrate this, let's use the example of music. We can be listening to the radio and we can hear a song, and all of a sudden it can literally take you back to a completely different time and space. It takes you to a memory. Now, not only will you have this memory in your mind, and you can remember the event, but you can also feel exactly the way that you did all the way back then in your history. So in this instance, we have a known memory in our mind, and our emotions have a relationship to that memory. Our emotions literally have the capacity to reconnect with the way that we used to feel. So not only do we just remember, we also re-feel. And in some cases, we can literally find ourselves reliving. We can re-experience. And this re-experiencing is an emotional re-experiencing. Now, if our conscious mind is aware of what's happening, if we're having a known memory and we know what's going on, if there's a connectedness or a known relationship between what's in our mind and the way that we're feeling, then when this happens, however powerful, our emotions will at least make some kind of sense to us. So even if we're re-experiencing some powerful feelings, as long as they're connected to a memory and thought, then our mind can have some sort of an understanding of this. So when we understand why we're feeling a particular way, then our mind can give this emotional experience a kind of anchor in time. It transforms the experience into a known memory. It files it in a particular format. So even though we're feeling it right now, we actually know where it belongs. But sometimes we simply re-feel something without a memory that's held in thought. Something can come along in our daily lives, like a song, or indeed any number of other things, including and especially loss and bereavement. And it can trigger or set off feelings from the past. It's opened up a file that's absolutely loaded with emotional content, and if it's not anchored or connected to a memory in thought, to a memory in our mind, then this can feel pretty overwhelming and very disconcerting. Rather than remembering these past experiences, rather than having a connection between our mind and our emotions, which enables us to format those emotional experiences and anchor them in the past where they belong, it can become more like a reliving. It's a re-experiencing. A current loss can be completely overshadowed and overwhelmed with the intensity of a past loss. In part, our feelings may well belong to now, but there may also be far more going on under the surface than we're consciously aware of. So if losses are not successfully filed, they actually become accumulative. They can also become accumulative if we go through a series of losses and bereavements that happen simultaneously, or relatively close to each other, and there isn't enough time or space to be responsive to our needs and to the internal program that's trying to run its course. And this doesn't necessarily relate only to a series of losses through death. There can also be an accumulative effect if we lose someone at the same time that we're going through significant major life changes. For example, if we're changing job, moving house, all of which involve loss. If we then lose someone during this time of transition, particularly if this is sudden or unexpected, we can find ourselves struggling to manage the sheer quantity of loss and change that we're trying to process. In the previous audio, I spoke about secondary losses, and I described them as being rather like a spider diagram. There'll be a central loss, the person who we've actually lost, and then there'll be loads of other losses that are also inherently there. They're like attachments, and they'll come in a variety of different shapes and sizes. Remember, there's only one internal file for loss, so all of these secondary losses will be in that file as well. So let's talk about these secondary losses, these attachments. I suppose that we might see them as sub-files, files within files. Secondary losses are things that are missing from our lives, things that we've lost as a result of the person who's died. Sometimes we've lost them as a direct result of their death and their absence in our lives. And sometimes they're the things that we've lost as a result of the kind of relationship that we had with them, and of the impact that that relationship had on our lives. This connects to the kind of relativity that I spoke about in the first audio of the series. There'll always be a relativity between the quality of the relationship that we had with someone and the quality of our process of grieving. It's like a reflection. And some of these secondary losses will be connected to this relativity. I'll say more about this in a moment. So some of these kinds of secondary losses are the kind of things that I spoke about when I used the analogy of pop-ups coming up on a computer screen. These pop-ups often relate to current circumstances, to our here and now everyday living, the everyday things that involve being together, like eating together, laughing together, the little things that were talked about and discussed, family time, or the things that we were involved in socially, the things that we did together. And although some of these things will seem quite obvious, and we may anticipate their loss, we don't always realise the enormity of these everyday secondary losses. And this enormity can come as a slow realisation as we adjust to the space that the loss of that person has left behind. Or sometimes it can come very suddenly. Something can literally pop up in our world at a time when we least expect it. And the sheer enormity of all of the things that we've lost along with this person can suddenly become apparent and really knock us for six. And all secondary losses will carry an emotional charge. We'll feel the impact of them. Every single loss carries its own process of grieving. And this happens not only in the immediacy of a loss, but also for some considerable time afterwards, like a little mini program running within the larger program. So these secondary losses can relate to our current circumstances and to our everyday lives right now, and they can also relate to events that stretch into the possibilities in our future. Family events, anniversaries, birthdays, Christmases, any significant and important life events will almost always generate pop-ups of some sort. I'll talk much more specifically about ways of managing these kind of events in the next audio of this series, which is about self-care. Events like weddings, starting a family, changing jobs, moving house. However good these important life events are, however wonderful they may be, if previously someone would have been part of these events in our lives and there to share it with us and enjoy it with us, then these events, as well as joy, will also carry a sadness with them too. And of course, if we're having to make a significant transition in life as a direct result of losing a close and significant person in our lives, like having to move house when we wouldn't otherwise have chosen to do so, this will generate significant feelings of out-of-controlness and evoke a lot of the more challenging emotions that I spoke about in the last audio. So every major loss will have lots of smaller losses attached to it, and these secondary losses connect to our current lives, and they also project into events in our future, where the loss of possibility has to be grieved for too. Now, I think that the most powerful secondary losses that we feel, and the ones that we find the most difficult to handle, are the ones that are connected to our past. And this is because if we do find that past issues are turning up during the process of bereavement, it generally means that they are unresolved issues from our past. They haven't been filed away successfully in an appropriate format or memory. And if this is the case, then they won't have been particularly well anchored in thought or time. To talk about this, I'm going to return to the analogy of a tsunami. During any bereavement, it is natural that our emotions will come in waves. Sometimes we can feel a gentle wave of emotion, but sometimes we can feel as though we've been hit by a wave the size of a tsunami. If we think about it, a tsunami is caused by a shift or a movement in the very structure of the earth. It's a shaking up and a break in the stability of a core structure. And this disturbance creates a wave of the most incredible power and force. And using this analogy, from an emotional point of view, anything that isn't anchored down, any parts of our life experience that haven't felt as if they're sitting on solid ground, and even some of the things that we thought were stable and pretty stormproof, will literally be picked up and swept along by the power of this phenomenal wave. A tsunami carries a lot of debris. So let's talk about and identify some of the debris, some of the things that we might find ourselves experiencing. First of all, there's the accumulative nature of loss. The files have been opened, and any past unresolved issues that we have around loss will be part of the debris that's floating around in the water. And we may need to separate out which feelings belong where, and be particularly thoughtful about seeking support to do this, especially if our losses go back into childhood. Any past unresolved issues that we had in our relationship to the person who's died will also be part of this debris. In the first audio, I spoke about relativity. There's always a relativity between the kind of relationship that we had with someone, the quality of the relationship that we had with them, and the way in which we then grieve for that person. So if you had a really rich and wonderful relationship with someone, the depth of loss that you feel will be proportional to the love and regard that you held for them. And this can feel absolutely devastating. If, however, your relationship to the person who's died was complicated and your feelings about them were muddled or confused, then you'll probably feel confused about your feelings during this process of bereavement. In complex and difficult relationships, there are often a great many secondary losses to deal with, and these can be acutely painful. especially if a relationship was in any way abusive or neglectful. The kind of emotional fallout that comes from an abusive relationship will generate a lot of debris. I know I've said before that even when we lose someone who we had a really difficult relationship with, that there's still a process of loss that takes place. And if you're in this kind of situation, I would want to really encourage you to seek support to help to sort through your feelings during this time. If we lose someone with whom we've had a difficult or abusive relationship, particularly during our childhood, there will be a great many things that we will need to grieve for that relate to the way in which that abuse impacted on our lives. We may have had trouble engaging in successful adult relationships, so we may feel as though we've lost time. We may feel as though we lost a significant part of our childhood. So there are lots of secondary losses here that will need to be grieved for. In truth, the relationships that have the deepest significance and the greatest impact in our lives are of course with the people that we live closely with, our primary families and our intimate partnerships. And for most of us, these relationships carry both the potential for the greatest reward, but also present us with our greatest challenges. Our primary family relationships are often the most difficult that we ever have to navigate. Our primary family are in our lives by default. They're the family that we've been born into. Or indeed, if we were adopted or fostered, they're the family where we were placed. It's not a conscious adult choice. So any complex family dynamics and any complex family history will also be part of this debris in the tsunami, of the debris that's being swept along by this wave. If you have been either adopted or fostered in childhood, then loss will be very big for you, and the level of emotional support and understanding that you received will determine the size and the content of the file that you carry. There'll be a relativity. However we look at this tsunami, it's full of emotional content. Some of it will be known to us, and some of it will not. In the last audio, I spoke about the fact that if we've ever experienced or had difficulty with a particular emotion in our past, or if we have particularly strong or negative associations with any of the emotions that naturally surface during the course of bereavement, then when that emotion surfaces, even if it's extremely appropriate to feel this, then those emotions will also be amongst the debris. They'll be a big part of the wave, and we can literally feel out of our depth with the way that we're feeling. Just as we file all our losses in one place, we also file and store any unresolved issues around specific emotions in a way that link them together. It's rather like a cross-referencing kind of system or a search engine. Let me give you an example. Anger is an emotion that many of us struggle with. And as I've said before, it's always present in this process of bereavement. Now, if we've become afraid of anger, either of being on the receiving end of it, or of feeling any anger ourselves, if we don't know how to express our anger safely, then we'll probably have found some very elaborate and creative ways of not feeling it. Now, if we don't know how to voice our anger, even if we're in a situation where it's completely appropriate for us to feel this way and to have an assertive and responsible voice, and we end up suppressing our anger continually, if we repeatedly sweep our own needs under the carpet in order to suppress any feelings of anger and frustration, then we'll inevitably develop a significant backlog. It will stack up. Then at some point, sooner or later, something will come along and effectively open that file. And out comes the pile of anger that's been stacking up over a period of time, and this can be like an explosion. When this happens, our reaction can be completely inappropriate and out of proportion to the actual event. The reality is that the anger we're experiencing is not just about the actual event that's happening right now. It's also about the multitude of things that have previously happened, the things that we've squashed and ignored. So any emotions that we would prefer not to feel will be part of that huge tsunami. Some of these associations with difficult and challenging emotions will come from past events and experiences, and others will come from the attitudes and beliefs that we've simply absorbed from the world around us, both during our past and in our present time as well. Throughout our lives, we inherit a whole package of beliefs and messages that become interwoven into the very fabric of us. And this will include our family's attitudes and beliefs towards death and dying and grieving, and also the social and cultural attitudes that we experience from the people around us. Just as we talk about having a carbon footprint, we also have an emotional footprint. It's an emotional legacy, and we inherit this from our parents, just as our parents in turn inherited an emotional footprint from their parents before them. And likewise, we pass on our emotional footprint to the next generation. And this inheritance will include any complicated issues and difficulties around loss, sometimes literally from generations before us. If significant emotional difficulty or any kind of trauma has taken place and wasn't processed and filed away successfully, then something of this will be passed on down the generations. It's an emotional legacy. And sometimes these may be known about, and sometimes they're not. It's an emotional legacy, and it will have an impact on the way in which we grieve. I'm going to bring this audio to a close. Now, my hope is that I've been able to give you an idea of some of the emotional complexities that can take place or become activated during the bereavement process. And my hope is that this will help you to gain some understanding of the way in which you may be feeling. The more that we understand the way that we're feeling, the more able we are to handle any of our more emotionally challenging experiences throughout our lives. And if we find ourselves experiencing something of a tsunami, or we realise that some kind of a file has been reopened, there's actually an opportunity here. However challenging this may feel, when something surfaces, we actually have an opportunity to begin to reformat and refile whatever it is that's actually showing up. In the aftermath of a tsunami, there is always the opportunity to rebuild. And bereavement frequently will serve as a catalyst for us in this way. It opens up those files. In essence, Pandora's box gets opened. And of course, whenever we experience pop-ups arriving in our world, it's really important to know exactly what's happening and to understand why this is taking place. And this in turn enables us to file these pop-ups appropriately. Our understanding enables us to grow and to move through our emotional experiences. In the next audio of this series, I'm going to focus on self-care. So if you found that any of the kinds of things that I've been talking about are resonating with you, or ring true, then it's going to be pretty important that you can become actively involved in finding the right kind of support that you need and the appropriate level of responsiveness. So in the next audio in this series, I'm going to focus on self-care. I'll be talking about where you can access support and the many ways in which you can engage in being emotionally responsive to yourself. Thank you for listening and take care. This is copyrighted material 2015, Jenny Burgess, the A to Z of Emotional Health.